I want to talk a little bit about the role of ngModel in a directive and what the formatter is and all of that stuff. So I've started out by creating a plunker with just an ng app, and everything is scaffolded. So you see that 1 + 1 is translated into 2. So we have Angular's running. Let's create a directive. Let's call it, of course, my syntax is completely wrong. Of course, we use the getter on the module, and then we name a directive, call it my directive, and let's pass in a function that returns our object, which let's not let it do anything yet. And then let's use this, my directive closing. And let's also go ahead and actually put in a little template that just renders out an h2, hello world, h2 closing. So let's see if that would, yeah, that works. Okay, so the directive works and it renders out our template. And now let's, to have a proper ngModel reference, let's create an input that has an ngModel on it. So I'm just going to put in an ngModel search or something. Yeah, placeholder, also search. Okay, and the idea here is that we have a connection between this ngModel and the directive. So I punch in ABC, right? And now this is bound to the scope variable search, as you know, because this is how ngModel works with inputs. And maybe this is an interesting first step. Let's look at how ngModel actually works with inputs. Like, how come there's an ngModel on the attribute or the DOM element input? Well, what this really means is there was a directive created in the, somewhere in the deep realms of Angular, which was bound onto the element input. So somewhere was a directive similar to, let's just create one now quickly. There was an input directive somewhere made, and this input directive has the ngModel taken to it, or uses the ngModel syntax, which I'm going to show you soon, and that makes it possible to use all kinds of ngModel stuff. And typical ngModel stuff is, for instance, one is ngChange, right? And that gives you a change callback, and this change callback is whenever the model changes. So it throws it, it goes pretty frequently. If you were to put a console log in here, it would bounce all the time whenever I do any single change in here. But then you can modify this as of, I think, Angular 1.3 or something, where you have ngModel options. And ngModel options, gives you the possibility to do like a debounce of, I don't know, 300 milliseconds, for instance, which then updates the model only when 300 milliseconds have passed after each consecutive key press. So with this ngModel, it has all this cool stuff, ngChange, ngModel options, and I think a few more also, that if used properly, could create really seamless APIs. Because in a way, think about what directives really leverage, or what they offer you as a set of developers, as a group of developers. They offer you a set of reusable code that always has the same sort of usability. It's very easy to actually document. Like, just use these attributes in connection, and then everything works. And by standardizing everything via the ngModel, you sort of have this option where it's possible for you as a developer to not only, you don't even have to read the documentation necessarily. If you know that this is an element and it takes an ngModel, it's almost self-explanatory, and you don't have to reread, or for the other developer, you don't have to write all kinds of custom documentation, because you can just basically say, yeah, it uses ngModel. So everything ngModel related, you just have, yeah. So it's right there for you, and that's really nice with the ngModel implementation. And there was a time when the way to pass in this search into this directive and then also, make it editable. So let's say, right, we put in an input here. So we put an input, and we wanted on this input to be copied. So let's put in a placeholder and let's say search copy, or not copy, but search reference. So it references this model here. The way we would do that before understanding ngModel, because it wasn't quite clear from the get-go how to actually implement ngModel properly. What we would do is we would do something, I don't know, we would always come up with these different words, but like entity or data piece. And basically then what you do is you pass in the same, like the reference to the scope element. So in this case, search, right? So this is on the scope. And you pass it into the entity, and then you read that out with the isolated scope. So you would go ahead and, create an isolated scope. Oops, right, here we go. And we would say, okay, so we expect an isolated scope parameter of name entity. It's going to be the same name, and that's going to be on the scope. So now in our link function, or post link, or any function that you want to do, on the scope element, that is the first parameter in the link function, on the scope element, we now have the entity, which means also our template also has the same word now, the same entity as a key on the scope. So what we could do now is we could say, okay, so ngModel on the entity. So here it wouldn't be called search, it would be called entity because that's what we called it. But now things are synced up, right? And you saw that there was a slight delay, and that's because of our ngModel options of debounce. So let's take that out because it was just to demonstrate how ngModel is extendable. But basically we have live sync if we want it, right? So there we go. So now things are synced both ways. So whenever I make a change on the one side, I make a change on the other. And that is actually, it's a pretty easy way to go about it. And here are the advantages. Advantage number one, it's very little code. You just have to put a isolated scope variable and things are done. Things are auto-synced, it's easy. Much less code if you want to use the just out of the box two-way binding, this input is synced with this input. So it's super easy to just set it up like this. So that's advantage number one. Advantage number two, it's not only simple, but it's also like very little code. So it's less to tread through. It's less to, having to understand and read as a follow-up programmer and for you to maintain potentially. So that's another advantage. But now we get to the disadvantage list. So disadvantage number one, whenever you write a new directive, you have to come up with a name that makes sense. And if you use 2 or 3 directives in conjunction on the same element, which, it sounds extreme, but it might happen. If that happens, you have to come up with names that don't conflict with one another. So now we go and we start to have prefixes for everything, which is kind of shitty. So you have to write like my directive entity for the one, and then my directive to entity for, the other directive. So we'd have to prefix all of the attributes to actually make sure that the attributes are that there's no naming collision on the same object. Of course, there wouldn't be outside of the same object, but on the same object, you have to think about this also. There could be naming conflicts. And then the other thing is, for a developer, he has to read your documentation, as I mentioned before, but also for a developer, you don't have this out-of-the-box ngChange, ngModel option. In order to make if you want an actual change, like a callback, if you want to somehow find out a trigger when this entity object has changed, you would have to register a watcher. I don't know if you know much about watchers, but the simplest syntax would just be to create a scope watch and put as a string the name of the scope variable that you want to watch. In our case, it would be entity. And then we have a callback whenever something changes with the scope entity. So anything lying under the name scope.entity is now going to be watched through this method. And then in here we have a callback. But watchers, there's, it has some, I don't know what you can call it, but it's not the best code in the world because watchers are pretty expensive performance-wise because they have this and you have to, I don't know exactly why they're so expensive, but they have this tendency to be over the top in checking for changes and like traversing the entire scope just because I want to watch this one property. So it's kind of expensive, but also you have to like clean them up. So there's the scope, I think, is it destroy or something, which is being called when the directive is destroyed, and that's where you should do your cleanup, because any watcher, it'll stay through the entire application if you don't destroy it. So you have to go ahead and destroy it. So this would be the var entity watcher watch or destroyer, I guess, or something. I don't know what you would call it. But it is this that you call, I think. Simple as that. You just call this method and then it's destroyed. So you'd have to, bind the result of the watcher onto this variable. And that's just, it's a bunch of... So there's some negative with this whole watching thing. And that's the only way, though, that you find out differences or changes on the entity, unless you make a callback, which you could implement from the outside. You could say you pass in sort of a method that that checks it on the outside if this changed. So you could do like an ng change here. So notify directive, right? That's what you could do. And now you don't have a watcher. Instead, you have this method called notify directive, which would be on the parent scope. And then this method could do a broadcast. I don't know if you know much about broadcast, but basically it's a way to communicate from one place to another. And then you could do on this here scope, which is the app scope really. But on this here scope, you could do a broadcast of some name. Search has changed or whatever. Yeah. And then in this directive, you could listen on the same string, search has changed, and then you can update. So this is a little bit less expensive than watchers, and that's one way to go about that. So it's kind of nice to use ngModel when you anticipate as a developer that the person using your directive is gonna wanna do stuff like ng change, ngModel options. He's gonna wanna implement these things. One more thing to note about ngModel is you should really only use it when there is the potential that the directive is actually going to manipulate the entity in some way. If it's just for displaying purposes, you should really not use ngModel. So the wording or the connection that you have to start having in your head is ngModel means this, whatever's passed into the ngModel is going to be manipulated by this thing. In case of an input, it would be manipulated by this input. So the search variable on the scope is going to be, it's going to be edited. And in a larger directive, this would mean that this directive in some way edits search. In case of, if you have a larger object, like what we could do is like we could say, okay, search.query, right? And then that would mean that there's a larger search object that contains many variables, query or filter or whatever else you want to put in. So now this means that by passing the entire search object in the directive, that kind of says, if this were an ngModel, and let's do it like this, if we pass an ngModel now as a search, that also tells the reader, the person interpreting your code, okay, the entire search object is somehow going to be manipulated in this myDirective. The myDirective allows some sort of editability functionality for this search object. So that's kind of a wording connection that you have to make as a programmer, both when creating directives and using directives. So, keeping all of the pros and cons in mind, here's basically where we've landed as a style guide. ngModel should be used when you want to edit the object, or the string, or the thing itself, the variable. If you want to edit it in some way, you should use ngModel. That allows for implementations of ng change and ngModel options. So it gives the user high flexibility with a lot of conventions, though. A lot of conventions that are well known with all Angular developers in the team. And at the same time, you have to be aware that you can only have one single model per directive. You cannot have multiple models. So that gives you that forces you to adhere to the style guide that everything should have one single purpose. Like, one directive should focus on the one purpose, which is in this case being a form, an editor, whatever, for the search object. Right? That's the purpose of this directive. So it's good in a way that you as a developer are restricted to only having one model being passed in, that you can only have one thing at a time, because it forces you to think in those terms. Yeah, and then when you want to pass in extra information, like, I don't know, some options or something, then you go ahead and pass in options in any form. In our project, we have established this UIS options syntax, but it doesn't really make much sense if this directive is not a UIS directive. So like, if it were a UIS directive, then it would make sense to have UIS options, because basically you have to follow up with you have to have sort of a prefix convention. So if this prefix is actually my, which it seems like, then you should also have my options. Or in the case of KCenter, the project called KCenter, you would have everything being KCenter or KC prefixed, or sometimes plainly options. But see, this is a point where I would disagree with the syntax here, or with the naming, because this is so generic that as soon as you have a second directive on this that does some other modification that also has an options, we already have a problem. So this is something that you should really stay away from. Yeah, the way UIB does it, UI Bootstrap, I don't know if you know them, but they're pretty large in the Angular 1 scene. And they've made a lot of directives that are very useful. And in the case of, for instance, the tooltip, let me give you the tooltip as an example. What they've done is they prefixed the main directive with UIB, right? So you have UIB and then tooltip, and that's the main piece of directive. And then they've also went ahead and prefixed the template also with UIB. So UIB tooltip and UIB tooltip template, all right? So you have a certain, like a double redundance in a way by prefixing it with UIB and then UIB tooltip. But then they simplify things. With the other options, basically you just omit the UIB because they figure at that point it's pretty clear that you will only have that one directive on here, the UIB. You won't have two tooltip directives. So there won't be a naming conflict by saying, okay, tooltip class and tooltip enabled and tooltip is open. So they leave out the UIS dash, which is, just like 4 more characters that they leave out and that they make things a little bit simpler. But that's their convention. And I think it's a pretty smart idea to say the main directive is prefixed with the project or the module name. In their case, it's UI Bootstrap. That's their prefix. But then any further attributes or any further options, they just have the name of the thing itself of the tooltip. So in my case, let's say our directive was called, okay, so my search, sure, why not? Then what I could do is I could prefix everything with search. So I could say, okay, so that I have search options, right? And so now, or then I would go even further and I would say KC for our project prefix. So I would have KC search and then search options. And then it's sort of, we have the connection through here. Point being, the ng model should be the main object that is editable and everything else is like fluff and options and stuff on top. Okay, let's talk now about the actual implementation of ngModel and how it works. We kick, scope to the curb, the isolated scope, because for our purpose right now, we don't even need an isolated scope at all. And what we write here is require, oh no, wrong syntax. We require ngModel. Now here are a few different syntaxes. There's the question mark ngModel, and then there's the, I don't know, some others. I think it just means whether it's required or not. So if you type ngModel, you'll get an exception that it's always definitely required. And if you write a question mark in front, it'll not complain, but then it'll do something. There's something here I'm not sure of. And if you're curious about that, read up more about this because I'm sure that there are many great articles about this. The vanilla usage is just to say require ngModel. And now, probably also already in the console, we can see that it's going to tell us that, well, what have I done now? That's from earlier. Let's save this and see. Oh, I typed in already ngModel. That's why. Let's take this out and it probably will complain that the ngModel is now required. So here we go. Now we get the exception that ngModel is required. So now let's pass this in. And now things aren't quite working anymore. If I type ABC in here, we do not now get, the search query as part of the input. Now that may be because, we didn't write query behind it. We edited this and made it into object. So let's see if that fixes anything. But really it shouldn't because we're referencing something here that doesn't even exist. We're referencing this thing called entity.query. And entity.query does not exist in any form. So this is where, ngModel implementation is a lot more complicated than the scope implementation because already now things aren't working like right out of the box. What we have to do as a next step, simplest way is to just say, okay, scope.entity is equals to, and now we have to go and add the other attributes. So we have the scope as a first parameter, then we have the element as the second, as you know. This is something, should know by heart. And then as last, we have the controller. Quickly about naming, it's always different. People shorten it, people make it longer, people add the dollar, people omit the dollar. I personally like the dollar because it shows that this is, Angular stuff, and it keeps your stuff different and separated from Angular. I personally also like the long one, except for attr for some reason. I'm a little bit weird that way. But yeah, it could also be attributes. And then, everything now would be the long name. It's a little bit willy-nilly, to be honest. And I agree that, a group of programmers should have one convention there. Maybe one day we'll have a good one. And what you will put in here is the, I think, model value, I think is what you want. Okay, so now what this does here, it actually says that when the directive is initiated, then it takes the model value of the controller and binds it onto the entity, all right? There's one problem with that though. It won't be updated if I do anything later, because this is on initiation of the directive, which is done, when you load the page pretty much. So this code right here doesn't do what you would expect it to do. And again, I could do like a broadcast, but I could also do something else, which is the formatter. The syntax here is formatters.push, and then, yeah. So there is a $prefix list of formatters that are added to any ngModel. And I think initially there's like 2 or 3 out of the box from Angular. And basically what it allows you to do is that before a ngModel is being output in any way, and outputting an ngModel happens every time the ngModel changes. Because, like, let's say you have a float with a bunch of decimal points and you want to reduce it to 2. So this formatting that happens, where the output is different from the model value, the actual model value. And you don't want to do that as a filter because it's not just display, it's actually editable. It's editable, but it's supposed to display differently in the input, or in the display situation where you want to display it. That's where the formatters come in, and the formatters thus they're hijackable. But many times you don't actually want to change the formatting of ngModel, but you want to use this pipeline, this formatter's pipeline that's being called every time the model changes. You want to abuse it or use it for some other purpose. In our case, you want to use it to update the entity. And I think it should, yeah, see, now already we have synchronization, but only the one way. We have one-way synchronization. And this is very relevant because if we delete stuff out, well, I know why that is, but I mean, I think that's for another day because that's because of the dot annotation. But it's actually, you know what? Let's take the word query out of here, and let's take the word query out of here. And now it shouldn't work. Yeah, okay. Now it's as expected. Yeah, and the reason why this is working now, and the reason why it's working the way it is because whenever the model changes, the actual model that is being passed into this directive, which is the search, so only outside, that's when this method is being called, or really this method here, in part of a chain of a bunch of formatters. So if you wanted, you could add a bunch of them. So you could add more, and they would all be processed after one another. I don't know if there's ever going to be a use case where you're actually going to use the formatters as intended, meaning manipulating and influencing the model value for display. Because there's a difference between the view value and the model value. I don't know if you know this, but I think there's a view value, or at least there's a set view value method. And so these are different, and you can influence them separately and you can access them separately. So really this is what the formatters do, but in this case, we're just hijacking it to get an update on the model. So when the model is being updated, we want the entity to be influenced. And this is very similar to the watcher that I've declared previously in the isolated scope. The difference being, though, that it's less heavy and that we don't actually require a scope variable to be already on the directive that we can watch, because a model you can't just watch. I mean, I can't write scope.watch and then I don't know what parameter I would even use, but let's say like ngModel or something. That doesn't work. Instead of this, you just use this, and it's a lot less heavy on the application. So there are a lot of advantages to this syntax, and that's really all there is to it. You get the model value passed in here. So instead of accessing the controller model value, you could do like so, and it does the same. And the reason why it doesn't sync back is because when we delete the string, we only actually influence the entity, so the scope entity, and we don't tell anywhere that the scope entity should actually bind back, onto the model value. And here we're going to close the circle and like round off this workshop. This is where we could do something like ngChange, model change or something, and then we could declare a method in this directive, scope.modelChange as a function, without hoisting to make it simpler. And here we just go ahead and we say, okay, so controller.setViewValue, open close parentheses, and we want to set it to the scope entity. And now we have a two-way binding. So let's see if this works. ABC. And then we take this away and we take this away. Okay, so now we go both ways. This is for the incoming changes. So anything going into the directive, we get notified here and we find out here. And everything outgoing, we set with the set view value. And that tells the outside world, that tells the actual ngModel that something is going on. And now this implementation is really all that is very, very basic, but this is all that you need. These 6 lines of code or these 2 functions, that's really all you need to implement ngModel to scope binding back and forth. It's a lot more than what you did for the isolated scope, but now we can use stuff like, let's go for, let's see, let's put an H1 down here, and let's just output search. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put in a debounce. So ngModel options, debounce 300, and now we should experience the following. We should see the following. Let me see if I can, guess beforehand. So whenever we input something from this input up here, from the primary input, it updates this model immediately. But whenever something is supposed to happen from inside of here, it waits 300 milliseconds before it updates. Meaning, if I type something up here, it immediately gets populated down here and in the H1. But if I type something in here, both the input and the H1 will wait 300 milliseconds. Let's see if that is actually the case. So I'll type A, B, C. Okay, everything is immediate. 1, 2, 3. Okay, perfect. Now if I release or delete the 3, it should wait. It should be slow. Yeah. Okay, perfect, right? So now we've created a custom ngModel options handling just because we added the ngModel here, and we now have, this back and forth between the content of this directive and the outside world. And really, this is extendable to any extent. I mean, now I've just put a small template, but you could put a large template in there with its own form with, I don't know, 10, 20, 30, however many input fields, and it'll all communicate back to the outside world with the ngModel. So in the end, using ngModel in your directives is actually very instinctive for both you writing the code and writing the directive, and for the developer using it.